Chapter 8 of Baiting the Bears by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8, in which Phil receives a testimonial of the banker's gratitude. A realization of his imminent peril had turned Mr. Lockwood's face to ashen gray, and his eyes were fastened helplessly on Rowland's menacing countenance. The affair was altogether too desperate for Phil to stand upon the least ceremony. He sprang forward and dashed up Rowland's arm. The shot caused his finger to twitch upon the trigger, and the revolver went off with a report that startled everybody in the office, as well as persons who happened to be in the corridor at the time. Phil swung arm around under Rowland's chin, pulled his head back, and grasping the revolver with the other hand, wrenched it away. Then he released the broker, but held him back under the muzzle of his own gun. It was all done in a moment, and the reaction caused the banker to fall back half fainting in his chair. "Send for an officer," said Phil as Weaver ran into the room, closely followed by Reese, while Enoch stood in the doorway, staring for all he was worth. "What for?" gasped the cashier in some bewilderment. "Broker Rowland here has just made an attempt on Mr. Lockwood's life." "Impossible!" exclaimed Reese, who was on friendly terms with the accused broker. "All right," replied Phil sharply. "Ask Mr. Lockwood." The banker was trying to pull himself together. "A glass of water, somebody?" he asked in trembling tones. "Get some water, Enoch," ordered Weaver, hastening the support of his employer. "Put down that weapon, Thorne," cried Reese authoritatively. Phil refused to obey this mandate, as he didn't think it altogether prudent from the glare in Rowland's eyes. "Don't let that man escape," said the banker after sipping some of the water Enoch brought. "I won't," answered Phil, and Reese had nothing more to say on the subject. "Send for a policeman," ordered Mr. Lockwood, regarding Rowland with a shudder. Reese, much against his will, was compelled to pass the order on to Enoch, who at once departed on the errand. All the clerks in the office were now crowding around the open doorway of the private office, and they were reinforced by persons from without who had been attracted by the report of the revolver. Nobody could guess what the trouble was, but it seemed to be serious. Phil's attitude with the pistol, of course, drew all eyes on Rowland, and showed that he was the cause of the rumpus. "Well," snarled the broker at last, "I suppose it's the tombs for me. But the end isn't yet. I'll remember you for this, Thorne. I'm a good hater, as you will find to your cost." "The less you say here, the better it'll be for you, Mr. Rowland," replied the boy significantly. "You made a big mistake drawing a gun on Mr. Lockwood." The broker flashed a look of bitter enmity at Phil, and said no more. The banker got on his feet and walked nervously up and down his room 2 or 3 times. "I wish you'd try and clear the room, Mr. Reese," he said at last, nodding at the doorway. "Go back to your desks," the bookkeeper shouted to his fellow employees with an unpleasant voice. They reluctantly withdrew through the gathering mob behind. "Gentlemen, you will oblige me by standing back," he said to the other spectators. Then he closed the private room door. Enoch found a policeman near the corner of Pearl Street and brought him up. "What's the trouble?" he asked as he forced his way into the private office. "I give this man in charge," said the banker. "What's the complaint?" "Assault with the intent to kill." "That's a serious charge, sir. You'll have to come to the station." "My clerk here," nodding at Phil, "will make the complaint, as he was present and saved my life." "Very well," replied the officer. "I will go with you," said Rowland. "You will oblige me by getting a cab at my expense." The policeman agreed, and a cab was telephoned for. Rowland, the officer, and Phil entered the vehicle when it arrived and drove to the Old Slip station, where the boy made the charge against the broker. Phil made a brief statement, while Rowland refused to say anything except to make a request that his lawyer be sent for. He was then taken downstairs and locked up, while Phil went to his delayed lunch. "But gee," he said to himself, "Rowland has got himself in a hole this time, and no mistake. He's liable to go up the river." When Phil returned to the office, he found that Mr. Lockwood was so unstrung by the affair that he had to be taken home in a carriage. Next day, soon after the banker came down to his office, he sent for Phil and thanked him for his prompt action of the day previous. "I am sure you saved my life," he said with much feeling. "I really believe Rowland was wound up to such a pitch that he would just as soon have shot me as not if I refused to make good the loss he sustained by the break in G.W.&O. He held me responsible for starting the panic on the floor because my broker threw 3 lots of 5,000 shares each of the stock on the market in quick succession. I worked 2 years for Morris Rowland," answered Phil, "and I never knew him to be over particular as to how or when he sold out on the exchange. He is one of a class of brokers who maintain the right to do as they like over everybody else, but are the first to squeal when they are pinched by their own methods. I have no use for such a man. It isn't my fault that he was behind GW&O, nor that he held on till he was caught by the crash. Evidently he has been badly cleaned out, and he thought he would try and bulldoze me into helping him to square his losses. Now, Thorne, you had better get your hat and coat, as we will have to be at the Tombs this morning." Phil and his employer got into the waiting cab and were driven to the city court building in Center Street. When the case was called, Morris Rowland was brought across the Bridge of Sighs, as it is called, from the prison annex. He was represented by eminent counsel. Lawrence Lockwood testified in a clear and concise manner, and his evidence was in no manner shaken by cross-examination. Phil was equally cool and positive when called to the witness chair. The magistrate seemed to be satisfied that the banker had had a very narrow escape, and he held the prisoner in high bail for the action of the grand jury, which was subsequently furnished by friends of the accused man, and Rowland was allowed to go that afternoon. On the way back from the Tombs, Mr. Lockwood ordered the cabby to drive down Broadway. He stopped the vehicle at Benedict Brothers Jewelers, and got out and purchased an elegant watch and chain. He ordered it to be suitably inscribed, and 3 days later, when it was delivered at his office, he called Phil into his private office and presented it to him as a slight testimonial of his gratitude for the signal service the boy had rendered him. The entire incident was rather disquieting to Reese and Weaver, and in a somewhat lesser degree to Enoch, as they had perceived that Phil had established a strong hold for themselves upon the good graces of the banker, and that they had their work cut out if they were expected to get him out of the office now. "That boy seems to be wallowing in luck," remarked Weaver to the bookkeeper a few days after the episode just described. "It seems so. Hang him," snarled Reese, jabbing his pen viciously into his inkstand. "There isn't any use depending on half measures now. We've got to bring a serious charge against him somehow if we hope to do him up. Otherwise, we may just as well keep our hands off. He's got the inside track with the boss. We've got to bring things to a crisis in such a way that the old man can be made to think that Thorne is taking advantage of his good opinion. The question is, how are we going to do it? We'll have to go slow. Probably chance may turn the scales our way. If so, we must be prepared to take instant advantage of our opportunity." "That's right," coincided the cashier. "I'm with you to the limit on this. I hate that fellow more and more every day." "I think I guess the reason," said Reese with an unpleasant smile. "He's cut you out with the typewriter." Weaver flushed up at these words and looked annoyed. "No matter whether he has or not, I want to see him out of the office, and I'm ready to take some risk to accomplish this discharge." "Don't talk foolish, Weaver. I expect to get him out, and without any risk whatever to us." "I wish I felt half as confident about it as you seem to be. I should have a very poor opinion of myself if I couldn't manage to get the best of a boy of his age," said Reese contemptuously. "Don't spoil matters by being overconfident, Reese," replied Weaver cautiously. "Thorne isn't such an easy proposition. He showed his nerve the other day when he faced Rowland and disarmed him all by himself, and Rowland is bigger and stronger than he in every way." "There are more ways than one of killing a cat," said the bookkeeper carelessly. "By the way, are you going to Jessup's tonight?" Jessup was a high-toned gambling resort on 44th Street, much frequented and moneyed by men about town. Reese had managed to get an introduction there, as he was passionately fond of games of chance of the character in vogue in that establishment. He was also an expert card player, and his object was to unveil Weaver into a private game at one of the small tables provided for visitors and work him for as much as the cashier could stand. It was not an honorable way to treat his friend and office associate, but the less said about honor in reference to Reese, the better. Weaver, unfortunately for himself, didn't know the man he was hand and glove with. "Yes," said the cashier with some eagerness. "I'll be glad to go with you. I've been waiting for the chance, you know." "All right," answered Reese, with a feeling of satisfaction. "I'll meet you at the Hoffman House Cafe at 9 o'clock." And while his two enemies were holding the above conversation, Phil at his desk was pondering over another venture he was contemplating on the stock market, for he had got a hold of a tip that day that a combination had been formed to boom A, B, and C stock, and he was figuring how much of his $23,580 capital he would risk in the venture. End of chapter 8.